beforehand. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so here we are, and for those that are just joining the recording right now, we are looking at Matthew 27 today. And before we actually start with Matthew 27, I want to take a look at something that has to do with an interesting detail, which is not necessarily having to do with hatred of Jews, although I think it does. But let's take a look at it. Let me put it up on the screen as well. I put it in the chat box, and okay. We're going to see in a few verses that Judas commits suicide, according to the account here in Matthew. And what they did is he tries to return them. It actually doesn't make sense to do this before. Sorry. Let's go back to let's go to the text right now. Ignore what I just did right now. It doesn't make sense pedagogically. And if I could ask you, John, if you could read the first two sections of chapter 27. We're in Matthew 27. Just need you to unmute. Oh, there you go.
All the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you. Just to, again, there's a emphasis here. You see that there is all the chief priests, right? Rather inclusive, all the chief priests and the elders. Whether the elders and the scribes, I think that they're the Pharisees as well, though we're going to see Pharisees spelled out before. And what I said last week was, I think it was like to show that everybody ganged up. But even though the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not get along with themselves, everybody against this common enemy ganged up on Jesus here. And that's how I understand this. I read this. They all conferred together, they plot together, and in comes Pontius Pilatus, the governor, who we know is a historical 20-year period between 10-year period between 26 to 36 of the Common Era. It doesn't necessarily mean that this happened under his reign. It doesn't mean that this text is necessarily historically accurate, but that's the story. There are historical aspects of it. He is known in Jewish sources to be an extremely cruel character. And in Luke, in the parallel Luke, he's also comes out to be a bit of he's more wicked than here. Here he appears actually a lot more neutral, and that we'll have to talk about that as the hour goes on, the 2 hours go on. In any case, they bring him to the governor. There was a kind of a court case before this, remember? So I guess the idea was he was brought before the Sanhedrin, the 71 elders, and there he was accused of blasphemy. If you remember, two witnesses came forward. That's the requisite. I said there's a bit of a problem with it from a reality point of view, because the Sanhedrin wouldn't have been meeting on the Passover, and it still seems it's the holiday. So again, it's not so much about oh no. Sorry. Now I have a tech problem. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. But let's go on. Let's go on to read about this, what happened to Judas, right?
When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders. He said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money. After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price. Verse 10. And they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me.
Okay. So This is, we haven't really been looking at the synoptic gospels to see what's in, what's out, what John has, what the others don't. But it is significant here to make note of the fact that this little paragraph, this little story, is not in the other versions of the Passion. So we need to ask ourselves: so why was it included here? Whether it was and then it was taken out of the others, or whether it was added here, that's harder to follow. But what part does it play when we read the gospel according to Matthew? And maybe I'll ask that question. In the back of your mind, where it's not in the parallel accounts, what does this do? What does it do here? What does it provide us with as far as the narrative is concerned? Anybody?
Well, I think it makes him, much more of I mean, to commit suicide is, a terrible thing. And, and then again, to remember that the Gospel of Matthew is written primarily to a community of Jewish Christians. So I think that there's a lot of, any anti-Semitism in this probably goes to like a purpose because of that.
So what makes this more anti-Semitic?
That they didn't want his money, that even the Jewish authorities didn't want his money.
So in not wanting his money, they didn't allow him to do tshuva, to repent. Really important concept in Judaism. It is in Christianity as well, but it's good to know the Hebrew word tshuva, which doesn't mean repent as much as it means to return onto the correct path. And here he was, and that's a really important thing, especially in rabbinic literature, right? But also in Hebrew Bible. And they needed to take that money from him in order for him to do that. That's how he makes amends. And yet they don't allow. It makes them more sinister. It makes them looking worse. An important part which now, if we take a step back and we say is Matthew a little bit more anti-Jewish than the others? Yeah, it seems so, at least from this, right? And by the way, it could be the person writing this that's for another time. That's for Matthew in general. Is a Jewish person writing for Jews, inner circle criticism, which is very, very difficult criticism. Many of you know that I'm very much to the left when it comes to Israeli politics, and although that hasn't been my major troublemaking in the Jewish world, has been in other circles, but there are those certainly who head the organizations that I support and I'm part of now in the last 7 years that I've been in this country, that have been called exactly these things. The worst for criticizing Israel's policy about the Palestinians have been absolutely demonized in this way from the inside, right? So I would say we're from the inside and we're giving this criticism because it needs to be said, which in my mind, as I've already said, is the whole thing with Jesus in any way. It's all an inner criticism that kind of got out of control. I don't mean that in a bad way, but it went way beyond its plan.
Understanding, he does this with a pastor, understanding
Okay, so
difficult things in the Old and New Testament.
Okay, so I think that's not meant for all of us. Okay, I think we muted. So now let's take a look at now. Interesting, right? This field, this potter's field, right? There's this it's potter's field. This translation that it's the field of blood. Does anybody know where this comes up again? This is your knowledge of New Testament literature. It's in the first chapter of Acts. There's kind of a brief of this is where we were, but the story is different there. And if you want to see that, then you'll have to come to the next group that I'm doing with Father Steve Kinney in Austin. We're going to begin that in the second half of May, and we're going to be.
Can you give us that date, Rabbi David, when that's?
Yeah, hold on just a second. Let's get up the flyer. Yeah, and
that just sounds fantastic too.
Steve has a real good academic background in New Testament literature. He's a PhD. I think it's PhD. I don't think it's a theology doctor. I think it's a PhD. But let's bring that up here. That is this one here. I don't have it handy to put in the box, but we can. It's easy to find on our website as well. And so it's going to begin Thursdays from May 19th, and basically every Thursday, unless we have to cancel it for some reason, like something's going on.
Great.
And I'm particularly proud of the name.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't vouch for the contents of anything I teach, but I can be very proud of the names. The names are very good.
We'll put an ad about it in our church newsletter too, for sure.
Great. Okay, we'll get Madalena to send that to you. Okay, so let's go back to. We're going to go now to that extra page that I put in the chat box, and I'm going to throw up on the screen right now a little bit about this particular place and a theory I have. Which, when I say there's a theory I have, it means that I'm not sure I thought of it myself. It's probably something I read over the last few years that I've been dealing with these texts. And I don't, because I'm not in academia, I don't take meticulous notes. I don't have the old days. I had a card. Remember the card boxes, note cards, and for my master's thesis I had everything. No, don't do that anymore. But in any case, this is a picture of archaeological areas. This is anybody who can picture what Jerusalem looks like. It is to the southeast, but mostly east of the Temple Mount. The southwest of the Temple Mount. So if you know modern day Jerusalem, it's in the valley below the what's it called? The film studio place, the Cinematheque, below the Cinematheque. And so that's a really interesting site. If we were to go on a tour there, I don't know how much you can actually see today, but we could spend hours looking down on it and talking about ancient texts that deal with that particular place, which is not in Jerusalem. It's outside of the walls of Jerusalem. And its most ancient task or role in history, even pre-Israelite history, was most probably where the Molech was celebrated, and whether that is actually sacrificing children or just passing children over a fire of Molech, which was something that was hotly debated, no pun intended, when I was in the university in the 80s. I don't know what the bottom line is now, though. It's a place which was identified, at least in collective memory, with child sacrifice. Whether it actually happened there or not, we don't know. So that's one thing it's in it. Another thing is the story we have here that we're going to look some of the texts, and then and from an archaeological point of view, it's hugely important for two reasons. Number one, it's where the oldest example of biblical writing is found, from 4th or 5th century BCE. It's the priestly benediction, the priestly blessing, on silver, inscribed on silver. When it first came out, I remember I was in rabbinical school, I think at the time. We said it must have been the not so knowledgeable priest cheat sheet. So they couldn't remember by heart, so they had it like on an amulet, hanging a pendulum hanging from their neck, so they could quickly cheat.
Or it's just the old people that can't remember it.
Right. Well, most probably though, or my friend Bill Gross, who's a collector of Judaica from pre-modern and modern times. Says it's one of the oldest examples of a Jewish amulet. That would be, and that was found in that area. Another thing is the burial cave of the family of priests, of which Caiaphas was part of that family. So that's an interesting thing. So there was already, it was an area of burial. That's what it was used for, and so that's in the background of this story being told. I think we'll skip over. This is just interesting in itself, Jerome's commentary. Everybody points out that there's no prophecy like this in Jeremiah. There is something in Zechariah, though, that would fit this. And I like this because Jerome talks about a little Hebrew book that he found, that he got more information from, which is not from, it's apocryphal literature or some sort of other literature. But now I want to prepare for what's coming. We're coming for. So just a little bit more. Here, the word in Greek is agros hematos, and which means field of blood. Agros, like the word agriculture. Hematos, like hematology, right? So that, but in Acts it's called akel damax, hakel damax, and that is Aramaic for hakel. Hakel is field, and damach is literally in Aramaic would be your blood, but it's blood. And the really interesting thing is that in Aramaic and Hebrew, Rabbinic Aramaic and Hebrew, damim is the primary meaning is blood. A secondary meaning is money. And I wonder if there's another. There's all sorts of euphemisms or other words for money, right? Dough and bread and silver, even, whatever. There's different kinds of words for money, but in Hebrew it's damim. It's so there's a connection between blood and price already, and hence you get the blood money kind of idea. They're being very, very proper. Back to the priests in the section that John read, they're being very, very proper and say, "Oh no, we can't use this money, right? We could do it." So what do you do with the money? He threw it out. He threw it down. Whether he threw it or placed it there, there's debates in commentaries as to what the Greek says. He kind of threw it down, but if it's translating something from Aramaic, it would have been he just placed it. It's not like he threw it down and all spread all over the place. But they can't use, so they use it for something else, which is kind of part of it. It's in between, right? We can it's something they needed, right, to bury the foreigners, but. You may know those, the Jewish folks here know, I would imagine, certainly, but our non-Jewish folks here present may know that Jewish burial is a bit of a sticky issue, right? Most Jews want to be buried only in a exclusively Jewish cemetery. And in that exclusively Jewish cemetery, there's also sorts of challenges, like the one here that my predecessor, Rabbi Joe Horwitz, set up at the cemetery in Cathedral City down, the one opposite the county cemetery, Memorial Garden, I think it's called, Memorial Park. Set up a Jewish cemetery, but did allow for non-Jewish spouses to be buried next to their Jewish ones. That wouldn't happen in other Jewish cemeteries. There's many Jewish cemeteries in which that doesn't happen. Right? It has a lot to do with Reform Jewish ceremonies. Would some conservative today, yes, but still others no. In Orthodox cemeteries, there would not be a non-Jew buried in cemetery. But it's not just non-Jews who are not buried in a Jewish cemetery. Also, anybody else who else is not allowed to be buried in a cemetery? A Jewish cemetery? Sorry?
Could someone who committed suicide be buried in one?
No, that's just it. Now, today it's a little bit different, but traditionally, Jews who either committed suicide or became heretics. So, for instance, Spinoza, who was a good Jew, he wasn't buried in the Jewish cemetery in Amsterdam. And I'm really proud that I have parents, that my father of blessed Mary of memory, and my mother, who should live still many years. They took me for my bar mitzvah to visit Amsterdam, and they didn't take me to the Jewish cemetery. They took me to Spinoza's grave, which was very, very cool, very cool. So yeah, those who have suicided would traditionally be buried at the edge of the grave, just outside or at the very edge. When I was in yeshiva in the 70s, one of my classmates began to show serious signs of bipolar. And I knew about this stuff because I was from Southern California. How could you grow up in Southern California and not know about mental illness, right? Israelis were not, so especially in the Orthodox world, just didn't talk about that kind of stuff. And so together with a friend, we went to the head rabbi of the yeshiva, and we said, he won't go see somebody, he wanted to go see. He would, in any case, he ended up being in a place for people suffering from deep depression. He managed to get away, and he killed himself while he was there. And then at the funeral, so there were hundreds of yeshiva boys, right? We were all there. The family is very well known in Rehovot, the city where they were living. And the chief rabbi of Rehovot, Rabbi Cook, from the same famous Rabbi Cook family, said, we're burying him here in the middle of the cemetery because he didn't choose to kill himself. he killed himself because he suffered from a disease. He said, I remember, now this is 1976, 77, or 78 or so. In Israel, for an Orthodox rabbi to say he died because of disease that is just like cancer. That's what he said. It's like cancer. Cancer kills you. They said, that was a lot of progress there at the time, and that was a big thing. I had a friend, though, a woman who I grew up with who was living in the same area, Rehovot. She wasn't so lucky. She also suffered from depression, committed suicide. In that very same cemetery, she's buried on the outer edge of it. So that is in the background here of what we have, this Chakal Damach, this field of blood. So that's an interesting thing on itself. But so let's take it. Let's go ahead and I'm going to speak a lot more about that in Acts, because so what I want to say, the shortcut to what I want to say is this: it's already a place of burial. The author of the text is looking for a way to create something a little bit more sinister, to present the priests and the scribes and the Jewish leadership more sinister than perhaps they would have been otherwise. They don't allow for him to do tshuva, leads to him killing himself, which leads to buying a field. Doesn't say he was buried there, but in Acts it does say, in Acts actually it says it was his field, but there's something off with the field. And this is what I want to say, is that area is kind of like the Bermuda Triangle, not exactly, but it's an area of bad luck, of bad omens, next to Jerusalem. Both sides of Jerusalem, by the way, and the other side of Jerusalem, the east, is where they would send off on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They would throw the scapegoat, literally that's where the word comes from, the scapegoat, as part of the worship service for Yom Kippur. One goat would be sacrificed in the altar, the other one would be led out to the desert and thrown off of a cliff. And the Mishnah, actually, from the 3rd century Common Era, the collection of Jewish oral traditions that was put in writing around the year 200, 220, has a very detailed description of how that was done. Scholars later understood that was an area where there was some bad stuff going on, ancient, even pre-biblical stuff going on, of worshiping the he-goat kind of demon, goat demon. So the same thing on the other edge. You've got this holy mountain in the middle, and on the other edge, on the western edge of the city, there's a place of death. That's where burial grounds were, and that's where there was, at least in the knowledge, some sort of prehistoric memory of child sacrifice as well. And so it's not by chance that's where Judas ends up, according to this. I think that's why the story was added here, to make it not only the people more sinister, but also to make Judas more sinister as well. Even when he tried, he couldn't repent. He ended his life by his own hand, which is a big no-no, and then ended up being connected to that field in no-no land. Okay, I hope that wasn't a little bit too over complicated.
I will always think of no-no land.
No-no land. Okay, I ask forgiveness from any Italians here who have a no-no.
Yeah.
No-no is grandpa in Italian.
Oh.
As opposed to nonna, which is grandma. Okay, so shall we go on? Let's go on.
I think Michelle has a question, David.
Oh, please go ahead, Michelle.
Is it still the case that having a tattoo or any kind of alteration of your body excludes one from a Jewish cemetery? So
you'll notice that when I talked about the people who were excluded from being buried in a Jewish cemetery, I didn't bring that up. So it's a good question. The fact of the matter is that tattoo thing was made up, totally made up in the 20th century. There's no earlier sources for that whatsoever. Now you could say, well, because Jews didn't get tattoos. That's not the case. Tattoos have been around for a long time. They're mentioned in the Torah itself, but in the Torah it's mentioned in the context of idolatry. And so a tattoo then was an act of idolatry, which is why, as was certain haircuts as well. In the 20th century, I can't pin it down. I can't find and I did a lot of searching. Can't find who the first person to put it in print was, but you started to hear, certainly when I was a kid in the 60s, you started to hear that if you, this is for the benefit of those that don't know this tradition, if you have a tattoo, they won't bury you in a Jewish cemetery. By the way, the same thing, if you marry a non-Jew, in some cases, you marry a non-Jew, you won't get, they won't say Kaddish for you. Committed suicide, they won't say Kaddish for you. All those laws as well. This kind of holding above your head that when you want everything to be, when you want to rest in peace, you won't be allowed to rest in peace, right? And so that's something that some rabbi somewhere made up. Maybe sailors, Jewish sailors, were going out to the Navy. Who knows what it was? But Michelle, I have no written document now. I haven't checked contemporary Orthodox literature because I'm no longer in that world to see if that's still in there. I question that. I question whether that every Chaver Kadisha, that is Burial Society, Orthodox Burial Society, would refuse to do that. I question it, but it's something maybe to ask one of the Chabad rabbis in town. We have the Orthodox presence we have here in the desert is Chabad. Maybe they have some written sources they could direct you to. Okay, so if you ask, is it still the case? My answer is, I don't think it ever was the case. I think it was some mythology to discourage kids. By the way, altering the other thing that spilled over into body piercing, and nobody ever wrote the body. I've never heard of anybody be refused burial in a Jewish cemetery when they have multiple piercings. I mean, it's so common to see today. So many. That is. And I actually did a deep dive into piercing with when I was on the law committee of the conservative movement in Israel in the 90s, and we published a paper on. I don't think it's in English, a study on piercing in the Jewish tradition, and there was no reason to forbid it from a halachic literature point of view. Only later did people start to use this kind of thing. Well, God created your body this way, and changing your body in another way. Transplants as well, not transplants, organ donation is not an issue of not being buried in a cemetery. Organ donation was more about, in some very, very narrow areas of Jewish Orthodox law, was about, well, what happens when the resurrection of the dead, which is a normative Orthodox Jewish belief, the resurrection of the dead, and to which my answer was, if God can resurrect the body from the dead, I think God can find your kidney from wherever it went as well, or give you a new one, But that's my irreverent reply to that. So let's get back to the text.
And I think Amy's got a question too.
Sure, go ahead, Amy.
Sorry to interrupt, but I had always heard, and forgive me if this isn't supposed to be said, but that the tattoos when they were in prison in the camps during the Holocaust, that was extra insulting because you couldn't have a tattoo. I always grew up that was what I was told, and that was an extra. I mean, the whole thing, beside the point, but it was that the tattoo was extra because you can't get a tattau. I would say I don't know. I could ask my friend Scott Miller, who's actually in town, who's a Holocaust historian. My guess would be, though, that from a Jewish point of view, people were doubly insulted. I mean, let's put things into perspective as well, right? We know about the tattoos from the people who survived death, right? And I think mostly from Auschwitz. Now, so the insult was doubly. Now, was that the intention of the Nazis? I don't know. That kind of posits a certain amount of education amongst Nazis but perhaps. But what is certainly the case is what you heard. Certainly in the feelings of Jews who were tattooed, or those that survived, along with those with the children. Therefore, that it was doubly insulting because of the tattoo thing. Now, today tattoos are. I remember I was working with. I was the rabbi of the youth movement in the beginning of my career in Jerusalem, in Israel, of the conservative movement, youth movement, and we worked up at camp. And the summer ended, and so I invited the staff to come over to our house for Shabbat afternoon to have a drink and to just kind of reminisce how the summer went. And one of my colleagues, who was pretty right-wing conservative rabbi from LA, he was from LA at the time, he was there, and basically all the kids had been to India, right? This is the 90s, right? Mid-90s. They'd all been to India. All of them had tattoos.
They all had tattoos on. And so when they left, I said, so what do you say? Cool kid. Aren't they great kids? They have such great energy. He shook his head. He says, well, you got to wonder this, why they feel the need to rebel in such a way. I said, what do you mean rebel? They just spent the summer in a conservative movement Jewish summer camp. I mean, they did educational work. He says, no, because they're tattoos. I said, oh, they didn't have tattoos. They're not rebelling. That's the trend. There's no rebellion going on there, right? And that's been the case for decades. In many of the people here, right? If I got a tattoo in the 70s, that would have been rebellion. If I got a tattoo now as a conservative rabbi, that would also be considered a rebellion of sorts, I guess. But my own rabbinic view, and then we probably should get away from tattoos because we really veered from the text, is that my own view is that tattoos today, there would be nothing in Judaism to prohibit that. That's my own view, that what's prohibited in the Torah is about idolatry. It all depends on why you're doing the tattoo. If you're doing the tattoo, and I would say what needs to be done is to check to see if somebody wants to say something on their face or something in a place where everybody would see it. But three of this rabbi's daughters have tattoos. So it's nothing rebellious, at least in my house. Okay. Let's go on in the text if we can, okay? We're at 11, and Jim, you want to read 11 for us? You up to reading today? There you go.
Okay.
Actually, we don't have that up. We're looking at the thing that you posted.
Oh, okay. So did you see the thing I posted before on the text? Where well, you can get it for the. Let me post again the.
Okay. Well,
Okay, it's in the box in the chat box now.
Okay.
okay, just a minute. Got to get it to come up. Sorry, we're having trouble with our computer to find
Okay.
it. Just call on somebody else.
Okay, so Ron, would you read for us, please, from verse 11? We're in chapter 27, verse 11.
11?
Yeah.
Okay. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed.
Okay, so we understand why the governor's amazed, right? Jesus doesn't try to defend himself at all. What's the purpose of these 4 lines? In the way we've been reading the narrative.
To make the Jewish leaders look foolish.
To make them look foolish, but also for what's going to come, to make Pilatus, to absolve him of much of the guilt. Right? You know, had he tried to, you can imagine, had he tried, I would have let it, but nothing. He enters a guilty plea, who refuses to, get a court representation, all that kind of stuff. All right, so go ahead and read a little bit more. Now we get to a kind of a bizarre twist in this whole story. Remember, they plotted against him. They've decided he's got to go. They don't have the power to put him to death. They bring him to the Roman governor. Pilatus is there. Pilatus says, hello, try to defend yourself. Nothing, garnished. He's amazed. Now he tries to get out of it another way. Go ahead, Ron.
Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas, and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you, for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified."
Okay, so Ron, go ahead. What if we're reading this in the way we've been reading? What's been added on by this paragraph?
Okay, so 24. So when Pilate saw...
No. Well, I'm asking for your reactions to. I mean, you've read this many times, this last section. But what does this do for us in the way that we're reading the text?
Well, I get the feeling, of course, that the Pilate is confused because what's Jesus doing here that he has to make a judgment on or judgment against? Jesus has committed no sin, no crimes. And I think he just wants to get rid of it, get it washed out of his hands so he have nothing else to do with it. I was surprised about his wife. I didn't realize that she did send word to Pilate that I've had very bad dreams about this man. He is innocent. And I was kind of wondering, was Pilate just trying to satisfy the crowd? Did he want to get this washed over with and get out? I don't think he had any feelings whatsoever that Jesus was guilty of anything.
Yeah.
Outside of preaching.
And now he's even like he's a nice husband because he's listening to his wife.
Yeah. It's not me, it's my wife. Go ahead, Alan, go ahead. Just unmute first.
Okay, this is where we're headed, and you can see by reading this in this translation that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. So when we heard all those years about Jews being Christ killer and you killed Jesus, we know in black and white where it came from. There's no arguing, well, it was just a misunderstanding or it was this. No, this is black and white proof that Jews are considered to be the cause of Jesus's death. Now, I'm not going into anything else other than just what is said right here in this section that we just read.
So I want to offer a correction to what you said. You said according to this translation, I think you meant according to this rendition of this gospel, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because the translation here wouldn't change really the tone. Although that could happen in any given passage. Anybody else want to react before I expound upon something?
So I thought it was interesting that Barabbas is named Jesus Barabbas. I never realized that he's given that name. So, that's just odd.
So Jesus the Messiah or Jesus, now how did you pronounce it? Barabbas?
Barabbas, yeah.
Okay, anybody know what it is in Hebrew or Aramaic?
Jerk.
No.
Oh.
Anybody? Hebrew speakers? Bar, son of, Abbas. The S ending is from Barabba, son of the father.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. That's kind of a bit of irony there, probably on purpose. Yeah. And so Jesus the Messiah or Jesus the Son of God. In other words, it's purposely mixing it up in such a way that and he's known as a scoundrel, right? This guy. You may remember those who have seen the Mel Gibson movie. He's particularly colorful with bad teeth and everything, and he's like laughing hysterically and sneering and stuff like that. Really typecasted well. So yeah. Again, we have the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds. Everything is funneling down, like Alan said. It's all kind of focusing on how if it was up to Pilate, it wouldn't have happened, and so much so that we get this next section right now. Alan, why don't you read 24?
So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water, washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood." See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
And
Now,
go ahead.
I need to ask a question, and perhaps Pastor Jane would have the answer to this. He handed him, meaning Jesus, over to whom to be crucified?
Probably
Who
the
did the
soldiers,
crucifixion-
probably the Roman soldiers.
All right, look at the next line, Alan.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, to the next line says the soldiers. But as to what you said before, Alan, this is even more black and white because, and here's the damning line. The most damning line is they took it upon themselves, the guilt upon themselves and their children.
Their children and their children's children and their children's children
Well,
until the
yeah.
17th million generation.
Well, that is how I'm sure it's been interpreted, but it could also be interpreted in a more narrow way upon themselves and their families at the time. But yeah, it's pretty black on white. So again, Pilatus comes out smelling like a rose here. All the more so he washes his hands, and unlike Lady Macbeth, the blood comes off. Right? It seems like it because nobody kept on persecuting the Pontius family, that we know of.
I think when they do this the next time, like we'll have like this Pontius do that, and then Pontius Pilate wife gives him a big sniff and says, "Honey, you smell like a rose."
There you go.
I
Okay.
think Richard Jeffries.
Yes, Richard, go ahead.
I'm just still having some difficulty because I have 3 sheets I downloaded and none of them seem to match what you're reading. I can't find where you are.
So one of the sheets had like 5 sides to it.
Right.
And we're on the third of the 5 sides.
All right. I have that. So let me go.
Where the dialogue says Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. Can you see that little block of text?
Number 24.
Oh, at the very bottom. Yeah, I got it.
No, it's not at the bottom. It's in the middle of the page. So
now Jesus stood before the governor and
okay, the other side of that page.
Oh.
Or the next page. Middle of that next page.
Oh, Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified?
Yeah, that's where we
are.
are.
Okay, now I found my place. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay. Now, for those that are missing the sheets and can't get the sheets, that you can always look in online as well. We happen to be using the new revised standard or new NRSV version, and we're towards the end of the book of Matthew. But I want to take a look aside to ancient Jewish literature, some more ancient than others, because the hand washing thing I think is relevant. So John, just because you're the only picture I have in my screen right now, why don't you go ahead and read? Letter of Aristeas is a really interesting. It's meant to be the story of how the Septuagint came into being, the Greek translation that was done for Ptolemy, the king in Alexandria, to be the addition to the only book that was missing from all the books of for the Great Library of Alexandria. And there's one version of it that's added to, that's in apocryphal literature, the Letter of Aristeas, and there's another version of it in rabbinic literature, and they're some similar and dissimilar. But here, though, there's just this is in talking about getting all these rabbis, these sages together, getting them all together before they do the translating work. Go ahead, Letter of Aristeas, please, John.
In the early morning, they appeared daily at the court, and after saluting the king, went back to their own place. And as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God, and then devoted themselves to reading and translating the particular passage upon which they were engaged. And I put the question to them, why it was that they washed their hands before they prayed, and they explained that it was a token that they had done no evil, for every form of activity is wrought by means of the hands, since in their noble and holy way they regard everything as a symbol of righteousness and truth.
All right, so that provides an interesting or ironical point, perhaps, right? It's the Roman governor who's doing this abolition of hands. The letter of Aristeas is 2nd century BCE, right? So this is well before the time we're talking about, but it's in the consciousness of Jewish culture. This hand washing before praying. Do you have it when Catholics go in and they put the water, and genuflect with the water, I guess, and enters the church. I don't think you guys do that, right? But is there an idea?
It really is if there's a baptismal font. It's a way of remembering your baptism.
Right.
So it's much more common in the Catholic, but if there's sometimes Methodist churches will put the baptismal font right at the entrance, or Lutheran churches too. And it's just to you kind of remember your baptism.
Right. So I'm wondering if there was originally some connection between that and washing hands. Of course, in the Muslim tradition, it's not only washing hands; it's washing hands and feet and mouth before prayer. Yeah. Okay. So. And to this very day, that is the Jewish custom, is to wash hands, certainly in Orthodox circles. But there's another thing going on with hand washing, and that is something, before we go back to the text, this may not be one of the 613 commandments that was taught in Sunday school in the church, and the truth is not even in many liberal synagogues as well. There is a commandment that says, when a dead body is found in the countryside, and nobody knows who killed this person, then somebody has to take responsibility. You measure to the closest village, and the elders of that village, they have to bring a young cow, a heifer, out to that place. It's not the same, but it's similar to the red heifer. It's mixed up, by the way, in the Quran. Both of them are brought together in the same chapter in the Quran. And they break the neck of that heifer, and they wash their hands in the river. And they say, so this is not from the Torah, I brought it now, but I'm bringing it from the Mishnah, going into more detail how it was actually practiced. Just a second. Okay, can you see that, Mishnah Sotah? Okay, Jane, you want to read Mishnah Sotah? Mishnah was edited, oral traditions that were edited around 200, 220 CE.
Okay,
I think so. The elders of that city then washed their hands with water in the place where the heifer's neck was broken, and they say, our hands have not shed this blood, neither have our eyes seen it. That's from Deuteronomy. But did we really think that the elders of a court of justice are shedders of blood? Rather, the intention of the statement is that the man was found dead. Rather did not come to us for help, and we dismissed him without supplying him with food, and we did not see him and let him go without escort. Then the priest exclaimed, absolve, O Lord, your people Israel, whom you redeemed, and do not let guilt for the blood of the innocent remain among your people Israel. They did not say, and they will be absolved of blood guilt. Rather, the Holy Spirit announces to them, when you act in this way, the blood is forgiven you.
So I think we can see the parallels here. It's in the background of what's going on here. On one hand, this Jewish tradition based on biblical law, but developed in the rabbis and the rabbinic Pharisaic literature, that when there is a murder, somebody has to take responsibility. And what is presented in the book of Deuteronomy as something almost akin to magic, right? Making sure that the price has to be paid somehow. In rabbinic literature, it turns into something more. In other words, this rhetorical question: did we really think that the priests have to say, you washed your hands of blood? That's not it. No, it's that the fact that they didn't care for this man, they allowed a culture to be created in which a person could be killed in the countryside. They didn't. This person didn't have a home. It gives us a lot to think about today. And so this act of washing hands that's presented by the author of Matthew here, I think is extremely, extremely laden. I think it's very, very, there's a lot of baggage to it intentional baggage. How ironic it is that Gentile, right, the governor, the Roman governor, and Noch, and the one who is known to be so evil as well, adding from a Jewish perspective, he's the one. He acted in an ethical way, and his hand was forced. It wasn't up to him. His hands were forced by the Jewish reaction, the crowds. Yes, Alan.
Explain why he washed his hand.
I want to mention something right in concert with what you just said, that the way that this happened, I'm sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Okay, anybody else?
Is there any more writing, David, that you can give to us that gives us a little bit more understanding of that horrible verse, that one verse that's, been used so terribly about, you were saying it could be just us and our children, and was it a common thing to do? Or, because it just sounds so crazy.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else on hand, but I can certainly focus in onto that for next week if we want to pick up that, when we
just because that particular verse is so onerous, it would be onerous. It would just be helpful to have a little more context if you've got
right. It would be helpful if there was another manuscript that didn't have those words in it, for instance.
Right. Well, and just also what other, if that would have been a common saying in the or just whatever.
I hear what you're saying. Okay, I'll look into it. Yeah. Okay. Let's see.
I think
John has a question.
Yes, please, John.
We've passed the exact scripture that mentioned this, but one of the commentaries I have in my home mentioned that when it said the blood will be upon us and our children, they didn't keep going, because in this commentator's view, it was referring to 70 BC when the temple was destroyed. That was the next generation's life, but it was not 3 or 4 generations away or 5 generations away. It happened in history fairly quickly.
Right, I've seen that as well. In other words, the punishment did come. The punishment came for those people and their direct descendants, right? Not their going down with the destruction. They weren't cut off, right? But the destruction came. There was a certain amount of death. Yeah, I've seen that commentary. So that must be out there in a lot of places, John.
Well, it just was another way of lining up. How many ways do you hit a group of people, one after the other, after the other, after the other in this section?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's. Should we go on?
I was just thinking, it sort of reminds me of Meet the Parents, where poor Ben Stiller, it just one thing after another, he just can't seem to do anything right, and so then there's the next thing that he does that totally makes Robert De Niro mad, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. It just doesn't get a break. It's the setup sort of reminds me of that. There's just not one moment where our Jewish friends have a moment of redemption.
Okay. So I actually, as you were talking, I do see something here, and that one of the rabbinic commentaries I use for the Gospels, it does point out that, not just for synoptic Gospels, it doesn't include John, points out that this has a very Hebraic ring to it. The fact that for us and our children are responsible, but apparently that's known. That's a known way of doing Herodotus and Virgil as well. So I have to look up those texts from contemporary texts to see, or a little bit before, to see if that's just a form of speech, right? In other words, and yeah. So, but what is sure though is that we should all realize it was certainly taken literally as progeny forever, kind of, as generations afterwards. Yeah. Okay, Steve, you got something to say today? You've been quiet.
No, I I've been getting a kick out of a lot of stuff that we're talking about, and it's been really nice. But I think that by them saying we accept the responsibility for it, it gives people permission to continue to discriminate against them. Like in other words, I think that set it up for, anti-Semitism. We accept responsibility for doing this, and so for our children and everybody else. So it gives those people that want to discriminate, okay, they've accepted responsibility. Let's punish them, or let me put them down.
So, Steve, and everybody, it's actually a very Jewish thing to say, very Jewish thing to think. Let me give you these two examples that pop in my mind right away. You may have heard of the day of the 9th of Av in around July, August. The Hebrew month of Av is a day of a fast day, a day of mourning. The 3 weeks leading up to it are days of mourning. And because it's a day that commemorates the destruction of both the first and the second temple on the same day. Whether who knows what happened historically, but that's the way the memory, the group memory has it, and other horrible things, pogroms and all sorts of things. The Jerusalem, the Temple Mount was plowed under during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. All these things happened on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And in a famous rabbinic tradition, it says that was the same day in which the spies came back, and the two, Joshua and Caleb, they had a positive reply, but the other 10 had negative, and the people accepted the negative version of it, and that was on the 9th of Av. That's what God said, you're crying now, I'll give you something to cry about for generations. So that's really, from a phenomenological point of view, that's the same thing that's here, is that the progeny are always paying the price for what their parents did. Another example would be, and this is much later, this is not biblical, this is midrashic, and then turns into something of the Kabbalist post, let's say, 16th century onwards, is to stay up all night on Pentecost. The Shavuot holiday, there's a custom to stay up all night and to learn Torah, to study Torah. Why? Because there's one midrashic tradition, something called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the chapters of Rabbi Eliezer, which is 8th century around land of Israel, that says that when God was giving the law at Sinai, the Israelites fell asleep. And so we have to correct what they did then. We're going to stay up all night because they fell asleep. It's that same kind of looking for this balance, the cosmic balance in the cosmos kind of thing. Alan, what did you want to say? I can see you're agitated. Just unmute first. Unmute.
Rabbi, I'm just sailing along with all of you.
Okay.
We're getting close to my lapse of memory. I can feel it coming. So when I do, I'll raise my hand.
Okay. All right. Okay, I won't do any face reading. I'll look for those little hands in the corner that are hard for me to see. All right, then. Shall we go on?
Yeah.
Okay, then. So Michelle, would you like to read? Do you have the text?
I don't have the text,
Okay, then. So Megan.
unless you can screen share.
Let's go ahead and take somebody who's got. No, until I find the screen share, it's going to take time. So go ahead, Megan. Go ahead, and then afterwards, Steve. We're at 27.
27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him, and they took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him.
Okay. Jane, do you have any explanation for the reed? I didn't find anything on the reed. I'm not really sure what the reed is doing here. If anybody else has.
I wonder if it's like a mock scepter,
Okay, that
that's
makes
what
sense.
I think it might be.
That makes sense. The crown, of course, yeah. Crown of thorns. So this section is surprisingly absent any criticism of the Jews, right? These are Roman soldiers. But let's also remember that as much as the author here wanted to, in some way, had a thing, whether he was Jewish, or I assume he was Jewish, had a thing with his own people and how his own families, his parents, his ancestors played out with them. Let's remember also that the early Christians suffered even more so than they did from the Jews. They suffered from the Romans, right?
Well, I think too, this could be, you could look at it as that the Romans are doing a thing about the king of the Jews, so that they're making a statement about like how, that he's not the king of the Jews, but it does still kind of focus on something bad about being Jewish.
Okay.
I would say.
Okay, and that's his only crime also, is to say that he's Mashiach, right? Mm-hmm. Messiah, the anointed one. Okay. Steve, you want to read?
Sure. Oh, I am muted already. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. He was compelled, this man, to carry the cross. And then they came to a place called Galatica, which means place of a skull. They offered him wine and drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among them by casting lots. They sat down there and they kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews."
Okay. Now, in a second, the bearing of the cross thing, but just the wine thing, to remind you that we had last week about the wine and the Last Supper, and I'm not going to drink with you. The next time I'm going to drink with you will be in heaven. So the wine comes up here again, and it's going to come up in another kind of a slightly twisted or adjusted fashion at the end. But then we have this thing here about Simon. Why do we need Simon to schlep the cross? Anybody? I mean, yes, Jane?
Well, this has to do, and I've done some teaching about this before. I forget the name of the tradition, but it was an ancient tradition amongst soldiers, and you could make a soldier carry your stuff for a mile. That's why, like, you go a second mile, where you have that teaching. If somebody gives a mile, then you go a second mile, and you're only supposed to do a mile, because the soldiers could make the townspeople do anything for a little bit of time, and they hated that. But if they got caught doing a second mile, the soldiers could get in trouble. Like, that's dishonorable. So that's Jesus teaching about, if a soldier makes you carry his pack for a mile, go a second mile, because then the soldier will get in trouble. So that was like a clever, that doesn't really have anything to do with this, but Walter Wink, who I learned this from, said this is why Simon, you kept to carry it. It was a way of intimidating the townspeople.
Collective punishment kind of a thing, yeah.
Yeah, just remember that we're in control and we can make you do anything for a mile. So,
one of the reasons I ask is because I remember coming across this particular passage at Hebrew University in the 80s. And this is a very short comment about the binding of Isaac. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the two walked together. That's in the biblical text in Genesis. And it adds, like one who carries his own stake or cross, it could be understood either way, on his shoulder. And the irony there that Isaac is schlepping his own wood to be burned, right? And so to my mind, because I hadn't studied much of the New Testament, I just assumed that maybe this was, connected. The only way I think the connection is that this was a common punishment, right? To be crucified was a punishment. But to me, the story would have had more irony if Jesus had to schlep the cross himself. I didn't look in the other accounts. Is this common to all the accounts?
I believe, yeah. Simon shows up, I think, in each one of the, in fact, that's one of the stations of the cross.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve, do you have a question, or is your hand just up? Steve, do you have a question?
No, he was going to read. Yes, Jim, or what is?
It's Terry this time. Okay, so in Catholic tradition, Simon of Cyrene, because he was a foreigner coming in for this, and he got hooked into this. But his, I think his sons are traditionally Catholic saints or something. So this was a significant event for him to carry the cross, and it made a convert out of him and his family. That's tradition.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so why don't you read for us now then?
Oh, okay, just a minute.
We're at verse 38.
Yeah, we have a slightly different version.
That's fine, doesn't matter.
Okay. Then they crucified two bandits with Jesus, one on his right and the other on his left. People passing by shook their heads and hurled insults at Jesus. You were going to tear down the temple and build it back up in 3 days. Save yourself if you are God's son. Come on down from the cross. In the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law and the elders made fun of him. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Isn't he the King of the Jews? If he will come down off the cross now, we will believe in him. He trusts in God and claims to be God's son. Well then, let us see if God wants to save him now. Even the bandits who had been crucified insulted him in the same way.
Okay. And let's just remember the bandits are, I would assume, are Jewish bandits. There's Jews living in Jerusalem, right? So that's another way of stoching the Jewish community. The scribes and the elders, the priests, scribes, and elders, they're back in the story again, even though we didn't hear about them accompanying, but maybe we could even project backwards. They're watching, they're walking with, they're taunting the whole way. They're still very much in the picture. And of course, remember who it could have been Jesus Bar Abbas, Son of Man, or it could have been Jesus, Son of God, as is emphasized here. That connects the beginning and the end of this particular part of the narrative, the son of kind of a thing. And we're heading towards the home stretch now. So would you like to read, Amy? Just unmute first. We're in verse 45.
Hang on. Oh, there we go. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, this man is calling for Elijah. At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the other said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now, when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, truly, this man was God's son.
So something here in the narrative is off. You may feel, right? Because it kind of jumped to the end after resurrection. But yes, go ahead, Alan.
Where does the sentence that's here talking about the saints explain that, since that seems to be something that occurred many, many years later? The concept of sainthood, I don't understand in this context.
Yeah, I first of all, it could have referred to prophets. There were always sainthood is been around. Prophets are, and especially Elijah. Elijah is considered to be the saint par excellence, right? Even though he did a lot of, he was criticized in his lifetime by God quite a bit, but he goes up in a chariot, right? He never dies. And so let's kind of take it apart. My main point here would be that it seems to be there's there's an interpolation from a later editor or somebody added in because it's after this resurrection, kind of to go back and say, that's why this religion succeeded. So many saw the miracle themselves. But if we put that aside, we have Jesus up on the cross, and the last thing he says is, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. So that is not Hebrew, that's Aramaic. Eli is the same in Hebrew, my God, and it is an Aramaic translation of Psalm 22, which is Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. Why have you left me? And this is Aramaic, although it's different Aramaic than the official Aramaic translation of the first part of the first millennium that we have. Well, actually, I don't know when it's from. It's the first millennium, certainly from 1500, 1800 years ago. The Aramaic translation of Psalms that we have. But what on one hand, Jesus does nothing to defend himself to try to get out of it. And then you've got Jesus saying, why have you left me, God? But what, did Jesus' faith waver? So that to me is a theological conundrum that I don't have an answer to. Maybe Jane would like to speak to that. But what it serves in the narrative is actually a different purpose. And maybe that's why we don't have to answer the theological question. From a narrative,
you see him wavering a little bit. He goes out to the death. It's just showing him just how hard it is. He's so human, like he's doing God's will, but it's so hard that he still is like he's not just perfectly doing it. We see his struggle.
So perhaps it's the last ounces of humanness that are dropping out before it becomes entirely godly.
And then quoting the Psalm 22, and kind of bringing
right. So that what the function that this quote serves in the narrative, though, is actually quite different. It's because he said Eli Eli lama zavtani. Somebody heard Eli Eli Eliyahu. Eliyahu is in Elijah. Elijah's Eliyahu. Eli Eli. And so because somebody says, and why would they think of Elijah here? Because in Jewish tradition, Elijah is the harbinger of the Messiah. Elijah knows, and that's already out there in the world. That's already in the book of Malachi, with Second Temple prophet, Malachi. Here I will send upon you, and he's going to bring
They can't even hear the Jewish correctly. They can't even hear that's how low the crowd has gotten. They can't even hear the Hebrew correctly.
Or they're looking to hear something about Jesus still claiming to be the Messiah.
Yeah. But then
they want to hear that.
Why doesn't Elijah come and save him? There's kind of a taunting there then,
Right. So we don't really have a theological stress, as much theological tension as we might. I'm sure people have written about it, but still, I think just from a narrative, the art of the narrative here. And again, I would say if we're looking to demonize the Jewish public there at the time, they heard what they wanted to hear. They assumed the worst in what they were hearing. And then, of course, comes the wine again in a twisted way, with sour wine, vinegar. To me, that's symbolic. That the little droplets of wine in the narrative that say that no, you're not going to drink with me now. You're going to drink with me only in the end of time, or the heavenly supper, or whatever it might be. Okay.
Although they could, if that was today, they could do a commercial for kombucha.
A kombucha or a good wine vinegar.
Because that's a fizzy vinegary drink that everybody likes to have now. It's called kombucha.
Yeah.
So that would be like a wacky commercial.
There you go. I tell you, when we retire, Jay, we got another business waiting for us.
I know. I'm taking notes.
Marketing.
Be here first, folks.
Okay. Yes, John. Please unmute. Go ahead.
Gall, I assume is why they said it was bitter wine. But my fast research said gall was a very common poisonous plant. I had never run across that before. Was that to help someone die when they were being crucified? I've never seen that it was poisoned before.
Yeah, I don't know, but that would make sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, I don't know. For me, it's all this from a literary. I'm more focused on the literary function. When Jesus doesn't drink from the wine, or drinks from the last time, and then comes this, and then comes the sour wine at the end as well.
Well, I would add that gall, like something like that, just like whipping him. I know there's a theological meaning with the whipping and all that, but it was not uncommon because crucifixion was just, it could last for a really, really long time. And that was actually not only humiliating to the body, whatever, but it was also considered kind of humanitarian because it would lessen your time hanging on the cross. So anything that could kind of shorten your time was actually considered a blessing.
Okay.
Even though it's really gross.
So, so Pastor Jane, this is I want to honor you with this particular section.
I think Alan, did you have a question, Alan?
Oh, Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, Pastor Jane, wasn't there something, or is it just from a movie or something, where there was a soldier who takes his sword and stabs Jesus on the cross?
Yes, that's actually in the Gospel of John, Alan, and that's after he dies to see if he's dead already, and that's when water comes out, and then there's that tradition of like water and blood at communion and stuff.
So
like
that's another story.
Yeah, that's only in the Gospel of John, and that's got its own theological meaning for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I thought you were going to say, isn't there a soldier that sits there and he looks a lot like John Wayne, because that's of course in The Greatest Story Ever Told, where there's just, surely this man was the Son of God. Like that's like a classic.
Okay, and we go from Jane's love of movie to Jane's representative of
That's right.
Feminism and theology.
Pivot. Okay. So we're at 55, correct?
55, yeah.
Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee.
So without going into detail as to who everybody is, though, how do you find this, Pastor Jane? This is like in a crucial moment, right? And boom, who's there? I mean, who are the good guys or the good women, the good folk, right?
It's interesting that in all the Gospels, the women are the ones that prove to be the most faithful. And they're the ones that Jesus, they stick around. They don't run from the cross like a lot of the male disciples do. They stick around to watch Jesus being buried. And then they come the next day and Jesus appears to them first. The men have trouble believing them. It's really one of those like upside down, like status things. I think that that was a huge tradition in the early church. Even though they tried to whitewash so much of the women's high status in the early Christian community, I think a lot of the Gospel of Mary and some of the other extra canonical Gospels that actually have a much higher status for women in the early Christian movement, they all got like X'd out, and maybe some other parts of these more traditional Gospels got X'd out, but they never, for whatever reason, and maybe it's because it was just such a beloved and important part of the story, that the women had to be like have that stunning status, high status, at this most crucial moment of the story. That's my take on it.
Right, and they haven't finished their role at the end of the story. We're not going to do all of it, but they haven't finished. And what's interesting for me in the Gospel according to Matthew is that we didn't do this together, but those of you we did it with a different study group. The first chapter of Matthew, there's a genealogy of Jesus which is added, and there are 5 women mentioned in that genealogy. There are a lot more men, right, all the way through to show that Jesus is from the house of David, and the women are all very unique in their being stars, like in the Oscars, they're supporting roles kind of a thing, but they're stars of their own stories, whether it is Tamar, or whether it's Bathsheba, or whether it's Rachav the prostitute, or whether it's a Moabite woman, which all 4 of those women, including Ruth being a Moabitess, there are sexual issues in their background, and then of course Mary is in that list as well. So that's interesting that the author of Matthew framed the entire gospel with a very strong presence of women who changed history, so to speak. Yeah. So should we finish up? Do we have any volunteers to read?
I can read some more.
Go ahead.
When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb.
Okay, so here we've got somebody we talked a lot about in our studies together, the contrasting of characters and episodes, like, well, this is happening, this is in the meantime, this is happening. So here we have a Jew, right? This person is a Jew who's a contrast. He's the tzaddik, he's the righteous, the one in Sodom, right? Who is the only tzaddik in Sodom and Gomorrah, that comes forth. That also explains how there could be a tomb ready for Jesus, right? How if Jesus had no possessions, and they gave everything away, how could Jesus have had a tomb? What do you say, Jane? I see.
Well, I was going to say too, I think the way I understand this is that was one of the most shameful things about being crucified, is that you were put in a common tomb. Like, you wouldn't even have a marker where you died. And so I think my take on it is, like, this is a story almost that had to be added, because it would be almost too far gone for Jesus to be just lumped into a grave with a bunch of other people. So we honored Jesus' body as being honored by someone that's putting him in their own tomb.
Right. So just a step back, though, before I meant to mention the role of women in this narrative. We had a woman who played a part in the beginning of chapter 26. Remember, the woman who uses the expensive oil. And what I said, what my point with the oil was, it wasn't to prepare the body. I know that there's many commentators say it's preparing the body for death. To me, it's because of a symbolic anointing, as in the Messiah, that's the kingship, and therefore also Mount Olives is mentioned, and Gat Shemen, or gets whatever it is in English, Gethsemane, which means the place of the oil of where the oil press is. I think that's in the background of this as well, all because of being the king. And then you get to this, you have to have a tomb also. I would imagine this is written many years afterwards, when the tomb is already a sacred place, right? And hence mentioned to him. So it's not entirely clear. On one hand, the crucifixion happens at Golgotha, which means the skull, but also the tradition is that the Holy Sepulchre, and also the Protestant, American Protestant parallel to that in Jerusalem, which is outside near the American Colony Hotel, that they're also on a rock formation. So it seems to be the tomb was hewn nearby, or he had in any case, there wasn't a distance to go in between them.
Rabbi, I think we have a couple questions. Richard and John have questions.
Go ahead, Richard. Yeah.
But Richard need to take.
And he said in the evening, but wasn't it this time before? Wasn't he crucified Friday afternoon? Would that mean this Jew, Joseph, would have been conducting business on Shabbat?
Yeah, but the whole thing, this whole thing, because the holiday in Shabbat, that doesn't seem to factor into the narrative. That's what I said about the court meeting. It doesn't seem to connect really with realia so much. So that's why some people would say, and Jewish commentators said already, or early Jewish commentators, well, this can't be, this is totally fabricated, the whole story, because it wouldn't have happened that way. On the other hand, who knows what the level of observance was, and there are things that you do in honor of the dead. They didn't turn out to be Orthodox halakha today, that when somebody dies in a house, for instance, according to Jewish law, strict Jewish law today, you cover the body, you leave the body in the house until Shabbat is over. You don't deal with it. But I would imagine that there were those that didn't always accept that to be, and this being a situation where the body is up on the cross as well. So that, yeah. But I understand your question. Yeah.
And I think
John,
do you have a question too? John Jones? Your hand's up.
I didn't know my hand was up. I'll
Oh,
take it
okay.
off.
Just wanted to double check. I'm the hand monitor, so.
You just wanted a high five. It's like my grandchildren. All my grandchildren walking the whole time, they want a high five. Okay. All right, so Jane, the last section.
Okay. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise again. Therefore, command the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone.
Okay, so this too is one of the points brought up by also modern Jewish commentators, that the historicity of this section is questionable because all this posits that it was happening on the holiday, the day before. This here means the day of preparation means the preparation of the holiday. So when did they do the Seder? But didn't they just have the Seder beforehand? It's where is Shabbat in this whole thing? It's rather confusing, which has led many to say that. So this is not about history here, but that doesn't change the fact that it was used in many ways very differently, and perhaps the author of Matthew included this timing here to show that instead of preparing for the holiday of liberation and of redemption, because Pesach is a holiday of redemption as well. It's when the first fruits are begin to be harvested. Food after the long summer, winter, there's been nothing, and now food comes in. Spring is coming up. All these things, instead of dealing with preparation for their own holiday, this is how I read it, this is what they were doing. And that's why it's added here, I think. Okay. Comments or questions? Yes, Alan.
We have been reading tortuous language that describes something that is horrific, absolutely horrific. And the fact that it is still published in this time and day as a diatribe against Jews, somewhere, somehow, some group of people are going to have to say, stop. We cannot continue to publish this as if this were truly God's word. That's my point. I want to see somewhere, sometime, maybe not in my lifetime, but some funneling of truth to saying, wait, this is a historical story. This is told in a way to get people to pay attention. This is not necessarily valid. I don't know if that's going to happen. I would love to see big churches, big mega churches coming out and saying, we're not going to continue teaching this aspect of the gospel. But that's just me.
Well, I think, Alan, I mean, you make a very good point, and I think you'd find in mainline, progressive mainline Protestant, that's definitely the teaching that happens. There's a real emphasis on, that the Christians wanted, like oftentimes it's the Christians wanted to avoid being persecuted by the Romans after the temple fell, so they would create gospels that made it look like the Jews were all responsible, that the Romans didn't have any trouble, so that they would save their hide when getting tortured. So there's a lot of that kind of teaching that goes on. I'm not sure, I can't speak for megachurches in that, but a lot of megachurches tend to be much more fundamentalist, and they don't go in that direction, unfortunately.
So, Alan, you want to see an event. You'd love to have an official event, right? Let's change that. And there was such an event in a drawn-out fashion. It wasn't an event, but it was an eventful process in the 60s with Vatican II.
Yes.
Which is why we started with that. The other churches had it easy because they're not so doctrinal in the way that papal Christianity is, that Roman Catholicism is that they needed to have that very, very long drawn out process. But what I'd like to do, I'm kind of tired out right now, so I'm going to ask that we pause on this issue, and we'll begin with next week with the writings from the Methodist ideology that we can all read together, that Pastor Jane will read with us, to see exactly what you're looking for, I think.
Okay,
Exactly.
wonderful.
A rereading of these texts in a different way, the way that Jane said. So I think it has happened, Alan. Maybe you're just not on that email list.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Michelle's got a question too.
Yes, Michelle.
Okay. Well, I was going to mention that I think the Catholic Church in Vatican II attempted to ameliorate and modify this kind of disposition toward the Jews based on this. But I find that the reality is that these passages are read time and time again in the church experience, in the church worship experience. And because of that, I think it becomes embedded in the way the worship life of the church experience. The other thing is that my understanding of the history is that the kind of concept of Christ killer really didn't come around until St. Chrysostom in like 400 AD. And a lot of this kind of configuration of bias was really an evolution after Augustine made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. And then it was really a lot about indoctrinating, again, people in a tribal mentality if they were going to be Christians, to carry forward more of the structure of the Roman Empire, the hierarchy of the Roman Empire that derived the really the structure of the Catholic Church was derived from that.
It's constant. The Emperor Constantine was the one who.
Constantine, yeah.
Was the one that.
Yeah.
That's. I just wanted to correct that because Augustine worked in the church and he was a little bit later, but Constantine was the one that made Christianity.
You're right.
Legal.
That was my mistake. You're right.
And I just wanted to correct you on that one. Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah. But
that makes sense.
And so that history, though, understanding the foundational history and the evolution really is not part of either the church worship experience or the church educational experience, to put it in context. And it kind of has just, as Alan, as you point out, it just sort of has been on the continuous river of bias that goes down from one generation to another without further education.
But Michelle, I'll point out that we're having this class, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this study session together. And it's important for Jews and Christians to do it together. I personally would rather hear from Christians about their own religion than us. I mean, I can read about it, and we can all read about it. We can all hear about it. But I think because we're a group of people that have committed to come together to talk about it, I think it would be important to hear from the Christians to feel how they grew up, if that's how they felt about this way.
I guess I just bring this because I grew up in both a Jewish life and a Christian life. I grew up in an interfaith life, going to synagogue and going to the Presbyterian church. So, well,
I think, what's interesting too, like when you say that, Michelle, I have a couple of thoughts. One, it would be cool. I might, if I have time to do a little research, and in any case, I might be interested next Holy Week to create kind of a Tenebrae service that would have the text and then might have some historical background to help people understand better what those texts are, to kind of unpack some of that stuff. Because there's, as far as I know, there's no of the typical liturgical things that you do on Good Friday. There's very little that does, at least liturgically, unpacks the text as we go along. So I think that would be I'm interested to see if maybe the Unitarians or the Episcopals might have something, or the UCC, sometimes they have some stuff, but I'll take a look and see if there's anything like that. But maybe we'll create something for the Methodists this next year. But also I think, we get into this weird, why did Jesus die? And I think a lot of times, like when I was growing up, I never really thought about it being the Jews, because there's always this like Jesus died for our sins, and that's us. Like, I'm the sinner that put Jesus on the cross. So the idea of the Jewish people doing all this was softened by an equally like weird, like, sacred sacralization of this, execution, being that, we're all of us, the people that are like, it's our fault. And so I think, and that's not true for everyone, but I think at least in my background, that's always kind of was more on my thought than the idea it was Jewish people that did it.
Okay, Amy? Need you to unmute, though.
I grew up too that it was meant to be. It was called for in the scriptures. And this was, I guess, then the catalyst was the situation, though it was very dramatic. And that was part of the Holy Week experience. But that to me was not ever, that's why a lot of this is like, well, that's interesting. That wasn't ever part of my belief system. And then it was meant to be, and then here was the resurrection, and that is the message of, the other part was part of the overall experience, I guess, with the, being sentenced and being, but it was also that resurrection. It was the moment, but it was to be. It was,
there's so many different interpretations of this week and its purpose, and so many different lenses that it gets looked at. But neither here nor there, reading it, it's so the anti-Jewish slant is so pronounced. It's horrible. It's painful to watch, painful to read.
I'm looking at because I had these conversations with Father Andrew Green over the years, who's an Episcopal priest in our area, who's retired now. And I know that he was often asking for permission from the bishop to change the text in the lectionary, because they're a lot more disciplined than their whole.
We're freewheelers,
right? Whereas in the Catholic Church, I don't think you can get permission to change anything. But they're all there's alternate readings, and I know that, and this is one of the things that he would find. But I'm looking at the at the Apostles' Creed. For those that know, when they get to the part, he was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, and you know what? Why don't I bring this up on screen? And I know there's a difference between Episcopal and Catholic. So when you get down, it always struck me that in the Creed that he suffered under Pontius Pilate and was crucified, died, and was buried. Well, if this was being verbalized according to the book of Matthew, it would look a little bit different, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? And so I don't know. I don't know the history of the creed, and I just know it functions. You guys don't do this, do you?
Rarely.
Yeah. So that would be kind of I think that the church has, at least in the last century or so in this country, pulled away different churches from this kind, even if the reading is there. One by perhaps doing alternate readings, alternate lectionary, and the other is in the liturgy itself. Amy.
I've been in Methodist churches that it's at every week. That is recited, but I didn't grow up in a creedal church. I grew up in another denomination, so that wasn't part of my upbringing. But it is still used in some weekly.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes.
Some Methodist churches do it, some don't.
In the Presbyterian church, it's done every week.
Yeah, when I grew up in the Lutheran churches, it's just I'm not a creed person, so I don't do it very much.
Right. But and of course, Michelle, this is how things have developed for various reasons. And as we said at the outset, as we began our studies, this is not about what happened. That I'm less interested in what happened historically. That's just my own personal interest, and also we have no way of knowing. But how things were used, that's certainly the case. So Michelle, you bring up a good point, and Alan as well. It has been used. I think maybe, to my mind, what I've seen over the last 6-7 years of being a pretty close observer, at least here in the Palm Springs area, that's certainly that almost never comes up in church.
never comes up in sermons. It never comes up in the readings, that kind of stuff. And I think it seems to me there's an intentional avoidance of that. On the other hand, if we were to go to other kinds of churches, you mentioned mega churches before, other parts of the United States, certain denominations, other countries, we would most probably find a lot of a lot of the sentiment, the poisonous sentiment of Matthew still in it's what's being observed in practice. So I'm going to have to leave us now. But we'll begin next week with reading specifically from the Methodist theology / ideology, because we're doing this together.
And Rabbi, can we do a little bit, just touch a little bit on John too, because John is
yes, that's
one of the worst. And
yeah, that's the second thing. I don't think we'll be reading so much in John, but I'll try maybe prepare a series of greatest hits, greatest quotes.
Fantastic. And then next week too, we'll make our plan for a serious man, because I'm still on to that. We'll talk
because we're serious women and men here.
That's exactly. That's our first stab, Rabbi. You and me going on the road is
okay. Everybody, Pesach Sameach, Chag Pesach Sameach to everybody. Have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you to the Jewish Federation of the Desert. Thank you.
Thank you, Jewish Federation of the Desert.